Everyone ignored her at the party, until the Mafia Boss said, "Dance with me." Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. I stood near the edge of the ballroom with a paper-thin smile that had started to ache, the kind that looks polite from a distance but feels heavy up close, like holding a breath too long. The room was enormous, all polished marble floors and soft gold light, the kind of place where even the air felt expensive, and I didn't quite belong in it. People drifted past me in tailored suits and elegant dresses, their conversations flowing around me like I was a pillar they'd already memorized and learned to walk around. I adjusted the strap of my clutch for the third time in a minute, pretending I had somewhere important to be, pretending I wasn't counting the seconds. I'd come with a friend who'd been pulled away by someone more interesting, someone with a last name people recognized, and just like that, I'd become invisible. I watched reflections move across the mirrored walls and wondered how someone could be seen by so many and noticed by none. The music swelled, smooth and confident, and couples began to form on the dance floor, laughter rising and falling in waves. I told myself I didn't mind standing alone, that independence was a kind of strength, but the truth pressed in anyway, quiet and persistent. I noticed the glances that skimmed past me without landing, the way eyes assessed and dismissed in the same second, deciding I was background, not a story. I focused on small details to keep steady, the chill of the air conditioning against my arms, the faint scent of citrus and perfume, the gentle vibration of bass through the soles of my shoes. Somewhere behind me, a ripple moved through the crowd, not loud, just a subtle shift, like when a room collectively straightens its posture. Conversations softened. Laughter paused. I didn't turn right away. I'd learned not to expect anything meant for me. But curiosity tugged, and when I finally looked, I saw people angling their bodies, making space without realizing they were doing it. A man crossed the room with unhurried steps, calm and assured, as if the path had always been clear. He wasn't flashy, no grand gestures, just presence, the kind that changed temperature, not volume. I felt it before I understood it, a strange awareness settling at the back of my neck. His gaze met mine, steady and unreadable, and for a moment, the noise faded into something distant and unreal. I should have looked away. I didn't. In that suspended second, I felt seen in a way that wasn't loud or demanding, just precise, like someone had finally focused a lens that had been blurry all night. And as the music turned, slow and deliberate, I realized that whatever was about to happen would redraw the lines of this room, whether I was ready or not. I became aware of the room again in fragments, the low hum of conversation returning in cautious pieces, the clink of glasses, the soft brush of fabric as people shifted their weight, pretending nothing unusual was happening while clearly sensing that something had changed. The man who had crossed the room stood a few feet away now, close enough that I could see the calm precision in his posture, the way he occupied space without asking permission. He did not smile. He did not rush. He simply waited, and somehow that felt louder than any announcement. Around us, people pretended to look elsewhere while carefully listening, eyes flicking toward us and away again, measuring, recalculating. I felt my pulse in my throat and reminded myself to breathe slowly, evenly, the way I had learned to do in uncomfortable rooms. I had no idea who he was. Only that the crowd seemed to know. Only that their attention bent toward him like metal toward a magnet. I noticed the subtle things first, the way servers adjusted their paths to give him clearance, the way a pair of men near the bar lowered their voices mid-sentence, the way a woman in a sequined dress straightened her back, as if being observed by someone who mattered. I wondered what it was like to move through the world like that, to be anticipated instead of overlooked. His eyes stayed on mine, steady, unreadable, not appraising me the way others had earlier, not skimming for flaws or labels, but focused, as if I were a conversation he intended to finish. I became suddenly aware of my hands and what they were doing, gripping my clutch too tightly, fingers cold against the smooth surface. I loosened them, lifting my chin a fraction, refusing to shrink. If he was testing something, I would not make it easy. The music shifted again, slower now, the kind that encouraged proximity, and the dance floor filled with bodies moving closer together, laughter softer, more intimate. No one invited me. No one ever had at events like this. I had learned to stand at the edges and watch, to be gracious about being left behind. But now there was nowhere to retreat without making a statement, and I sensed that leaving would not go unnoticed. The man tilted his head slightly, a gesture so small it might have been accidental, except that it felt deliberate, like punctuation. In that moment, I realized he was giving me something rare, time to choose how I would be seen. The thought surprised me. Power usually rushed, pressed, demanded. This did not. It waited. I glanced around, taking in the faces that had dismissed me earlier, the ones that had passed by without a second look. Their expressions were different now, curious, wary, some even resentful, as if my presence had been quietly upgraded without their consent. The contrast made my stomach tighten, not with triumph, but with something steadier, a quiet resolve. I straightened my shoulders, meeting his gaze fully, letting him see me without apology. Whatever this was, I would step into it on my own terms. The room felt smaller, more focused, as if the night itself had leaned in to listen, and I sensed that the story people would tell later had already begun to shift, its center of gravity moving, settling unexpectedly on me. I noticed his hand before I noticed the rest of him, the way it extended calmly, palm open, not reaching for me, but offering an option that felt heavier than it looked. The music carried on, unbothered, a slow rhythm that seemed to underline the moment. He did not touch me. He did not crowd me. He simply waited, eyes steady, expression composed, as if he had already decided that patience was more effective than pressure. I could feel the attention of the room tighten, the way people lean forward without moving when something rare is unfolding. I wondered what they saw when they looked at him, what stories they already knew, what quiet rules bent around his presence. I wondered what he saw when he looked at me. I took a breath and placed my hand in his, surprised by the warmth, by the firmness that felt controlled rather than possessive. The floor beneath us seemed to shift as he guided me forward, not pulling, just setting a direction and trusting I would follow. We stepped into the open space together, and the crowd parted as if choreographed, faces turning, whispers beginning, and then stopping when they realized he could hear them if he chose to. He positioned us with an instinctive ease, one hand hovering respectfully at my back, close enough to guide, far enough to give me room. The distance mattered. It told me this was not about display. It was about choice. As we began to move, I focused on the simple mechanics of the dance, the measured steps, the rise and fall of the music, grounding myself in what I could control. I felt less like an object under inspection and more like a participant in something deliberate. His voice reached me then, low and calm, not competing with the music. "You do not look comfortable being ignored," he said, not unkindly, as if stating an observation rather than a judgment. I almost laughed, the honesty of it disarming. "I am used to it," I replied, keeping my tone even. His mouth curved, not into a smile, but into something thoughtful. "Used to does not mean deserving," he said. The words landed quietly, without drama, but they stayed. I searched his face for mockery or performance and found none. Around us, I sensed recalculations happening in real time. People reassessing what they thought they knew about me, about him, about the invisible lines that had just been crossed. Someone near the edge of the floor murmured his name, and it traveled in a ripple, Dominic Hale, spoken with a mix of familiarity and caution. I recognized it then, not from personal experience, but from context, from headlines skimmed and conversations overheard, a name associated with influence that rarely needed explanation. He felt me, stiffened slightly, and adjusted his pace, subtle, reassuring. "I did not bring you here to make you uncomfortable," he said. "I brought you here because you were standing alone." The simplicity of it unsettled me more than any grand gesture could have. I met his gaze again, steadier now, aware that whatever assumptions people were making, whatever stories they were beginning to tell, this moment belonged to me as much as it belonged to him. The music swelled, the lights glinted off polished surfaces, and as we moved together, I realized that for the first time that night, I was not watching from the edges. I was exactly where I was meant to be, and everyone else was finally catching up. I became aware of how naturally he adjusted to me as the dance continued, not leading so much as matching my pace, allowing space when I needed it, and closing the distance just enough to keep the rhythm intact. It felt intentional, like he was paying attention to details most people ignored. Around us, the room had settled into a strange stillness. Conversations reduced to background texture. The focus narrowed to the slow orbit we traced across the floor. I could feel eyes on us, curious and speculative, but they no longer felt heavy. They felt distant. Dominic's attention stayed with me, unwavering, and that steadiness did something unexpected. It calmed me. I stopped worrying about where my hands were, about whether my steps looked awkward, about how I might be judged. I simply moved. When the music softened, he spoke again, his voice low enough that only I could hear it. "You are not invisible," he said, not as reassurance, but as a fact. The certainty in his tone made my chest tighten. I had spent years learning how to blend into the background, how to take up as little space as possible so no one would be inconvenienced by my presence. Being told otherwise felt like standing in unfamiliar sunlight. I met his gaze and saw something shift there, subtle but real, as if he were measuring not my appearance, but my resolve. "I am not used to rooms like this," I admitted. He nodded once, acknowledging the truth without pressing. "Rooms like this are not used to you," he replied, and the distinction mattered. It reframed everything I had assumed about myself that night. As the song drew toward its end, I sensed movement at the edges, people preparing to step back into their roles, to reclaim the social order they understood. Dominic did not rush the moment. He let it finish properly, guiding me through the final steps with the same calm precision. When the music faded, there was a pause, brief but noticeable, before applause rose, polite and restrained. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture that felt more like closure than performance, and released my hand. The sudden absence of contact surprised me more than the contact itself had. He stepped back half a pace, giving me space, and for a heartbeat, it felt like the room was waiting to see what I would do next. I straightened, resisting the old instinct to retreat. I held my ground. Nearby, someone approached him, a man with an expensive watch and a practiced smile, clearly expecting immediate attention. Dominic did not look away from me. "Not yet. You did well," he said quietly. I frowned slightly. "At what?" "At staying," he replied. The simplicity of it lingered. Then he turned to address the interruption, his demeanor shifting just enough to remind everyone who he was in this space. I watched the exchange from a short distance, noticing how people deferred, how conversations bent around him. I noticed something else too, how a few glances returned to me, reassessing, curious now rather than dismissive. I felt different standing there, not elevated above anyone else, but anchored, like I had reclaimed something I did not realize I had lost. Dominic glanced back once, brief and deliberate, and in that look was a promise of continuation, not of possession, but of acknowledgement. Whatever had begun on that dance floor was not finished. It had simply changed the terms. The party continued to flow around me, but I felt slightly detached from it now, as if I were observing from a clearer vantage point. I stood near a tall table with a glass of sparkling water I had not asked for, but had somehow acquired, listening to fragments of conversation drift past. People spoke differently when they glanced my way, their tones adjusted, their curiosity thinly veiled. I recognized the shift for what it was, not admiration exactly, but awareness, the realization that I was no longer safe to ignore. I thought about how fragile that status was, how quickly it could disappear once the novelty wore off, and yet I felt steadier than I had earlier. I had not been changed by Dominic's attention. I had been revealed by it. A woman approached me with a polite smile and introduced herself, asking where I knew him from. The question was casual, but the intent was clear. I answered honestly, that I had just met him tonight. Her surprise flickered, quickly masked by something more calculating, and she excused herself moments later, already forming a new theory to share. I let her go without feeling the need to explain myself. Across the room, Dominic moved with practiced ease, listening more than he spoke, offering brief responses that seemed to satisfy without revealing anything. He carried authority without advertising it, and I noticed how often people sought his approval, even when they did not realize they were doing so. At one point, our eyes met again across the space, and he inclined his head slightly, a subtle acknowledgement that felt personal despite the distance. I did not rush to him. I stayed where I was, anchored in my own space, and the choice felt important. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time had a way of blurring in rooms like this. Eventually, he found his way back to me, not directly, but naturally, as if the room itself had shifted to bring us closer again. He stopped beside me, close enough that I could hear the faint hum of his voice beneath the music. "Are you all right?" he asked, not as a courtesy, but as a genuine check. I considered the question. "I am," I said. "Better than I expected to be." His expression softened, just a fraction. "Good. This kind of environment can be exhausting if you are not used to it." I studied him then, really studied him, noticing the lines of focus around his eyes, the stillness that suggested constant awareness. "You seem very used to it," I said. He exhaled quietly, almost a laugh. Used to does not mean untouched. The admission surprised me, and I sensed it had not been offered lightly. A server passed by, and Dominic took a glass from the tray, offering it to me without pressure. I declined with a small shake of my head, and he accepted that easily, without comment. The respect in that moment mattered more than the gesture itself. "You could have chosen anyone," I said after a beat, voicing the thought that had been circling my mind. He met my gaze steadily. "I do not choose based on convenience," he replied. "I choose based on presence." The word lingered. Presence. It reframed the entire evening, stripping away assumptions about hierarchy and value. We stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the party unfold, two people temporarily aligned in a space that thrived on performance. I realized then that whatever others believed they were witnessing, whatever narratives they were constructing, the truth of this moment was quieter and more significant. I had not been elevated by him. I had been recognized, and that recognition had changed the way I saw myself, regardless of how the night ended. As the evening edged toward its quieter hours, the energy in the room shifted from spectacle to calculation, people choosing their final conversations carefully, deciding what would be remembered and what would be forgotten. I noticed how Dominic watched those changes without reacting to them, his awareness constant, his attention selective. We stood side by side near a tall window overlooking the city, the lights outside stretching like a map of possibilities I had never considered myself part of. For the first time that night, I allowed myself to imagine leaving without the familiar sense of relief, without counting the minutes until escape. Dominic broke the silence gently, asking if I had enjoyed the event. The question was simple, but I knew it carried more weight than politeness. I answered honestly, telling him it had surprised me. He nodded, as if that confirmed something he had already suspected. He told me he valued people who noticed when they were being underestimated, people who responded with composure instead of resentment. I listened, aware that he was not offering flattery, but perspective. There was a subtle seriousness in his tone now, an undercurrent of caution that had not been there earlier. He did not romanticize the world he moved through, and I sensed he was careful not to pull me into it without clarity. When he spoke about responsibility, about the cost of influence, it was measured, stripped of drama, as if he were stating facts rather than building an image. I appreciated that restraint more than I expected to. I told him I preferred straightforward conversations that I did not like being made into a symbol or a rumor. His gaze sharpened slightly at that, attentive rather than defensive. "Then we understand each other," he said. "I do not collect stories. I respect boundaries." The words steadied me. They felt like a line drawn clearly on the floor, visible to both of us. Nearby, laughter rose briefly and then faded, someone saying goodbyes too loudly, the party slowly unraveling. Dominic glanced at his watch, a subtle signal that time was closing in. He asked if I felt comfortable getting home on my own. The consideration surprised me again, the absence of assumption. I said yes, though part of me wondered if that was still entirely true. He did not press, only nodded, accepting my answer without challenge. Before we parted, he handed me a simple card, unembellished, his name printed cleanly, a number beneath it. No instructions, no expectations, only an option. "In case our paths cross again," he said. The phrasing mattered. I slipped the card into my clutch, feeling its weight more symbolic than physical. When he stepped away, people closed in around him almost immediately, conversations resuming as if on cue. I watched him navigate them with the same calm precision, and then I turned toward the exit, moving through the crowd with a confidence that felt earned rather than borrowed. Outside, the night air was cool against my skin, grounding, real. I paused on the steps for a moment, looking back through the glass at the room I had nearly disappeared inside earlier. It looked smaller now, less imposing. As I walked away, I realized that whatever others had seen when Dominic asked me to dance, whatever stories they would tell, the most important shift had happened quietly, within me. I had learned that recognition did not have to be loud to be transformative, and that sometimes, being seen once was enough to change the way you moved through every room after. The days after the party passed with an unexpected lightness, as if something fundamental had shifted and I was still adjusting to the new balance. I returned to my routines, early mornings and familiar streets, but I carried myself differently now, standing straighter, meeting eyes instead of slipping past them. I caught my reflection in shop windows and hardly recognized the quiet confidence looking back. It was not arrogance. It was clarity. I thought of Dominic occasionally, not as a looming presence, but as a reference point, a reminder of a night when I had been acknowledged without conditions. I did not reach for the card he had given me. Not yet. I wanted to see who I was without that option pressing against my thoughts. Then, one evening, as I was leaving a small gathering with friends, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I hesitated before answering, listening to my own breathing, and then I picked up. His voice was calm and unmistakable. He said my name carefully, as if confirming it still belonged to me. He asked how I had been, not out of obligation, but with genuine interest. I told him the truth, that I felt steadier, more present in my own life. He said he was glad, and there was no attempt to claim credit. He asked if I would like to meet for coffee, somewhere quiet, neutral. The request felt balanced, an invitation rather than an assumption. I agreed. We met a few days later at a small cafe away from the noise of downtown, sunlight streaming through wide windows, the scent of fresh coffee grounding the space. He arrived on time, dressed simply, without the aura that had commanded an entire ballroom, and yet the same calm focus followed him in. We talked easily, about work, about the choices that had shaped us, about the difference between visibility and value. He listened more than he spoke, asking thoughtful questions, never interrupting. I noticed how safe the silence felt, how there was no need to fill it with performance. At one point, I mentioned how strange it had been to feel invisible for so long, and then suddenly seen. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Power can distort rooms, he said. It makes people forget themselves. I prefer spaces where people remember who they are. The words resonated deeply. As we finished our coffee, I realized something important. He had not changed my life by stepping into it. He had simply made room for me to step fully into my own. When we parted, there was no grand gesture, no promise made, just a mutual understanding that whatever came next would be chosen deliberately. Walking away, I felt a quiet certainty settle in. The night of the party had been an opening, not a destination. It had taught me that dignity could be reclaimed in a single moment, that respect could be offered without cost, and that sometimes the most powerful shift happened when someone saw you clearly and expected nothing in return. Whatever paths Dominic and I would walk from here, they would run parallel by choice, not obligation, and that knowledge felt like the strongest foundation I had ever known. As weeks passed, our meetings settled into a rhythm that felt intentional rather than rushed, conversations unfolding in places that encouraged honesty instead of spectacle. I learned how carefully Dominic chose his environments, how he avoided rooms that demanded performance and favored spaces that allowed people to speak plainly. He never pressed for more than I offered, and that restraint became its own form of trust. I found myself sharing stories I had not told many people, about years spent minimizing my needs, about learning to survive by blending in. He listened with a stillness that made me feel heard without being examined. In return, he spoke selectively about his own life, about the weight of expectations and the discipline required to remain composed when everyone assumed they knew who he was. There was a quiet integrity in the way he described his choices, a refusal to glorify power or deny its consequences. One afternoon, as we walked through a public park, sunlight filtering through tall trees, he asked me what I wanted next, not just from him, but from myself. The question caught me off guard. I had spent so much time reacting to circumstances that I had rarely articulated desire without apology. I told him I wanted to be respected in rooms I entered, not because of association, but because of who I was. He nodded, satisfied, as if that answer aligned with something he valued deeply. Over time, I noticed subtle changes in how people treated me when Dominic was nearby, but more importantly, how they treated me when he was not. The confidence I carried seemed to precede me now, altering interactions before they began. I realized then that the power I had reclaimed was internal, not borrowed. Dominic never tried to take credit for that, and I respected him more for it. One evening, as we sat across from each other in a quiet restaurant, he said something that stayed with me. Influence should protect dignity, not replace it. The words felt like a principle he lived by, one he expected me to hold him accountable to if necessary. That expectation startled me, and then grounded me. It was an equalizing moment, a reminder that whatever connection we were building rested on mutual respect rather than hierarchy. As we parted that night, he did not reach for my hand. He simply met my gaze and said he valued the person I was becoming. Walking home, I reflected on how far I had come from that night at the party, when I had stood unnoticed at the edge of a crowded room. The transformation had not been dramatic or loud. It had been steady, deliberate, shaped by choices made quietly and reinforced daily. I understood now that the most meaningful recognition was not the kind that turned heads, but the kind that aligned you with your own sense of worth. Dominic had offered me a moment that sparked that realization, but the work of sustaining it had been mine. As I looked ahead, I felt prepared, not because I had someone powerful beside me, but because I had learned to stand firmly on my own. Whatever the future held, I knew I would meet it with clarity, having learned that dignity once claimed could not easily be taken away. The story of that night eventually faded into something people referenced less and less, replaced by new events and louder moments. But its effect on me never diminished. Life continued with its usual demands, deadlines, commitments, mornings that required effort, and evenings that invited reflection. Dominic remained part of my world, not as a figure who overshadowed it, but as someone who walked beside me with intention. We never needed to define what we were in grand terms. What mattered was the consistency, the respect that did not waver depending on who was watching. One afternoon, months after the party, we found ourselves back at the same building for a different event, quieter, smaller, far less dramatic. As I stepped inside, I felt the familiar sensation of a room assessing its guests, but this time I did not brace myself. I moved forward calmly, greeting people with ease, aware of my posture, my voice, my presence. Dominic stayed a step behind me, deliberately so, allowing me the space to lead. I noticed the difference immediately. People responded to me directly, asked my opinions, listened. The shift was subtle but undeniable. At one point, a woman leaned toward me and said she remembered seeing me dance that night months ago. "You seem so confident," she said. I smiled, understanding more than she knew. Confidence is often mistaken for visibility, but I had learned they were not the same. Later, as the evening wound down, Dominic and I stood near the exit, watching guests say their goodbyes. He looked at me thoughtfully and said something quietly, something that felt like the final punctuation on a story that had begun long before either of us realized it. "You do not need anyone to choose you anymore," he said. "You choose yourself." The words were not possessive or dramatic. They were simple and true. I felt their weight settle comfortably, like a truth I had been preparing to accept. When we stepped outside into the cool night air, the city lights stretching ahead, I paused for a moment, taking it all in. The memory of standing alone at the edge of that first party felt distant now, not painful, just instructive. I understood that the most powerful reversal had not been when a man of influence asked me to dance, but when I decided I would never again disappear to make others comfortable. Dominic watched me with a small, knowing nod, as if recognizing that his role in this chapter was complete, not because he was leaving, but because I no longer needed him to define my worth. We walked on together, unhurried, two people grounded in mutual respect, carrying forward a lesson that did not belong to a single night or a single room. It belonged to every space I would enter from then on. And as the city moved around us, alive and indifferent, I knew that no matter where I stood, I would never again be ignored, because I had learned to stand fully in myself.